A few weeks ago I came across a gay teenager who had watched RockingMrE's videos and now actually believes that he is mentally ill. He has also internalized the belief that if you disagree with his position, it is simply because of your pathological inability to accept the truth of what he is saying. So there is literally no way of arguing with him. If you don't agree with him, you are part of the conspiracy to hide the truth. So people like this RockingMrE manage to cause actual harm with their vile, homophobic garbage. They are not just irrelevant, right-wing zealots venting on the internet. They influence their young audience and cause them actual psychological harm." End quote. Comment by a viewer posted on the first video in this series. So it's that time again. Time to tackle the second video in Stroking Mr. Ego series on homosexuality, titled How Homosexuality Was Declassified as a Mental Illness, which has a description of, quote, "We're constantly told that homosexuality was once unjustly considered mentally ill. But what led to homosexuality being declassified as a mental illness? Was there science or the leftist tactics we've grown accustomed to today?" End quote. This video follows on from the video I previously responded to, so if you haven't seen that yet, you may want to go back and check that out first. But with that noted, let's get to it.
Homosexuality was never scientifically declassified as a mental illness. Most would never dare question the mental state of homosexuality, but I will, because I acknowledge that mental illness consumes society if it isn't properly addressed. The ever-expanding list of sexual orientations is very hard to make sense of because the movement behind this drapes itself with objective science. But this science is shoddy, terribly researched, and rife with confirmation bias.
Well, I look forward to seeing your scientific breakdown of said consensus, utilising nothing less than peer-reviewed journal articles of high quality to first demonstrate how the current scientific consensus is victim of some mass bias as you present, but more importantly, how homosexuality is a form of psychopathology. Now I say more importantly since whether or not a bias as asserted does exist is really irrelevant when it comes to whether or not homosexuality is a mental disorder. See, the claim that homosexuality was never scientifically declassified as a mental disorder is predicated on the notion that it was at some point scientifically classified as a mental disorder. Now I've learned to spot the semantic game you're playing with all my years tackling religious apologists who love to say the existence of God was never disproven, trying to sneak by the assertion that said existence had been proven at some point. And just as with them, I'm not buying what you're selling. There never was a scientific basis to classify homosexuality as a mental disorder, which is why said classification was dropped upon further review. Now for you to show otherwise, you need to do more than simply cry and moan about how this went down. You need to actually show how homosexuality meets the requirements for a mental disorder as laid out in either the DSM-5 or the ICD-10/11 as supplied in the previous video. Fail to do that and your entire case falls with it, since we don't classify things as a mental disorder until they've been shown not to be a mental disorder. So what you are doing is trying to frame things backwards to how they actually are.
As many know, the gay liberation movement has been expanding sexual orientations for decades, and this is accelerating at an alarming rate. Currently, we're up to LGBTQ, Q standing for queer, although this is always subject to change because the ultimate goal is to make sexuality a fluid concept that doesn't make distinctions between reproductive desire and absolutely anything else, including paedophilia. For the uninformed, this is a lot to take in because this agenda has been building for so many decades, even well over 100 years.
All you've actually done in this segment is prove that you lack the most fundamental understanding of informed consent and why it is important to sexual interaction. Like religious apologists, you've thrown out the accusation that homosexuality and paedophilia are somehow intrinsically linked, even though most child molesters are heterosexual. But more important to the conversation is that this reveals a real danger in you as a person, since you seemingly cannot identify the difference between sex involving two consenting adults and child rape. That's a genuinely terrifying prospect that should discount your opinion from any pretenses of ethical concern. As for attraction to children, I don't know or care what causes it. Do note that if it is a sexuality like homosexuality, it is also a sexuality like heterosexuality. You can't have it one way without the other. The fact is, under both heterosexual and homosexual relationships, there exists the capacity for rape, yet only under homosexuality is that ever used as an argument against said sexuality. It's a double standard, yet does not help you in displaying how homosexuality is more of a mental disorder than, say, heterosexuality. We're still waiting for evidence on that.
It's therefore impossible to make heads or tails of this without understanding how homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness. This began when the sexual liberation movement made the decision to either discredit the fields of psychology and psychiatry or co-opt them. In many ways, both have been achieved because their modern manifestations are so political that they have virtually no credibility left. In my video, When Degenerates Take Over Society, I explained how mental illness should be objectively defined. In this video, I'm going to take this further by explaining how homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness.
To recap, Mr. E redefined mental illness as the denial of reality before later admitting that this definition is a failure and changing it in relation to religion as part of a special pleading fallacy to include harm as a qualifier, harm being related to his watery assertion of natural law which has no link or basis in science, said field being amoral by very definition and therefore does not prescribe any sort of behaviour. Mr. E's definition is as subjective as they come and, thankfully, is not the basis for either the DSM-5 or the ICD-10, which define mental disorder as, quote, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior, e.g. political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not a mental disorder unless the deviance or conflict results from the dysfunction in the individual, as described above. End quote. Now we're going to stick with the scientific definition of a mental disorder and not Mr. E's poorly defined word salad, since we are supposed to be discussing the science here.
You'll often hear people talking about how homosexuality is no longer considered a mental illness and how unjust it was to classify it as such in the first place. So let's see how credible the declassification of homosexuality as a mental illness is. In the early 1970s, psychology and psychiatry came under increasing pressure to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness. It's difficult to give this push a single name because it's made up of a multitude of far-left radicals that have never really been honest about their common cause. As a result, many people named this cultural Marxism, but intersectionality is perhaps the most popular academic term amongst leftists today. In the early 1960s, feminism began to take root, followed by the gay movement in the 70s. But these two movements were always just two expressions of the same ideology, because they shared the same beliefs about sexuality. Therefore, the push to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness was really just a leftist front, with gay activists and feminists joining forces in the same way that today's SJWs are made up of leftist radicals of all kinds, working as a mob to intimidate others or subverting organizations from within. These tactics are what led to homosexuality being declassified as a mental illness. I don't like to use the term homosexuality because it's a fabrication that stems from the origins of the gay movement in the 19th century, and a Trojan horse in our language, as we will now see. By the 1970s, this agenda had grown so much that it had the muscle to start forcing institutions to accept that homosexuality was as normal as being attracted to the opposite sex. The American Psychiatric Association and American Psychological Association, both shortened to APA and both leading organizations in their relevant fields, became the first targets because these major institutions could provide the credibility to make changes elsewhere. Note that the mistake preceding this was using the term homosexuality in a medical context, because this conditioned people to think about sexuality as more than one orientation. If this hadn't happened, it's unlikely that society would have seen same-sex attraction as something comparable to so-called heterosexuality, another fabricated term invented at the same time as homosexuality. The American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental illness in 1974, followed by the American Psychological Association in 1975, and this led to a snowball effect throughout Western society. But there was never any scientific research conducted to validate this sea change. Instead, people were pressurized and manipulated into changing the classification of homosexuality without proper scientific research ever being conducted.
So whilst Mr. E wants to pretend that homosexuality is some recent phenomenon, the reality is very different. Homosexuality has existed since before our species, which is why we see it in thousands of other species, including our closest living relative, the bonobo. But focusing solely on our species, and we find that homosexuality, as with trans identities, have not only existed, but have been a culturally significant part of our civilization since, quote, the late Paleolithic, if not earlier, end quote, as noted by Dr. David Greenberg at New York University, so at least 10,000 years ago. This is known for the existence of the queer shaman who transgresses boundaries of either gender or sexuality that has existed in some form in earlier civilizations on nearly every continent around the globe, and thus likely has a shared origin at an earlier point in human history, i.e. the late Paleolithic. But it wasn't all wonderful, it wasn't all rainbows and sunshine and warm meadows. There have been periods throughout various cultures where homosexuality was treated with some stigma, such as in India. Homosexuality is a part of Indian culture, appearing in numerous works of art and various texts. And whilst it was seen as degrading for a Brahmin, so a member of the priest caste, who partake in it, this was only to the same degree as having sex with a menstruating woman, and could be rectified by having a bath in one's clothes, as seen in the Manusmriti. Compare this to the next passage, which details how unknowingly accepting food from a member of a lower caste instantly degrades a Brahmin status within their caste, whilst doing it deliberately removes that status entirely and equals it to that of the person they accepted food from. So homosexuality was not seen as a massive deal among the religious elite, whilst outside the Brahmin caste, it wasn't really a problem at all. And that's the worst things seem to get. Homosexuality was acceptable, but sometimes seen as degrading, most often due to the perceived submissive member of a male couple, as with the Norse at certain points of time, whilst at other times the Norse saw it as perfectly acceptable, or even something to boast about because it was manly to sleep with another man. Then we have historical figures such as Hadrian, one of the 5 good emperors of Rome who was unabashedly gay. We then have the gay couple Nyankum and Kumhotep, who loved one another even though they were both married, to the degree that the two were buried together as lovers. We also have homosexual cave art from sub-Saharan Africa, but as noted previously, it goes beyond the mundane in some cultures, all the way to being seen as divine. To start with, we have the South American deity Tlazolteotl, who is the protector of the Husatec people, worshipped by both lesbians and trans priestesses. We also have Inuit mythology involving 2 men as the first people on Earth. We'll call them Adam and Steve, as I've already butchered enough names already. Fact is, Steve got pregnant from all the homosexual sex the two were having, yet found birth to be a little difficult, so Adam and Steve used some of the residual magic from the time of creation to turn Steve into Stephanie, so that they could give birth and father/mother all of humanity. homosexuality not only happened throughout human history, it has had a deep cultural significance. Yes, there were periods in which it was frowned upon or even sometimes criminalized, but these were flash in the pans and never lasted very long. This all changed, however, with the advent of Christian Rome and the foundation of the Theodosian Code in the 4th century Common Era, giving same-sex marriage the penalty of death throughout the Roman Empire. This then spread like a disease elsewhere, being taken to the Americas by Christian invaders such as the conquistadors, who found homosexuality to be so prevalent and accepted in South America that they introduced death by one of 3 means: the sword, the stake, or being torn apart by dogs. Likewise, the British colonialists took these ideas with them to the various countries they invaded, such as India, where they imposed Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code in 1860, which criminalized non-heterosexual love on the basis that it was unnatural, even though that statement is patently false, as already demonstrated. The perspective of homosexuality as an abomination which had spread first under Christian Rome and then colonialism never went away like the previous times. It stuck, and in sticking it bled through into early psychology, since early psychology shared in the bias seen in most fields of science that stated what we observe should match what the Bible states, and if it doesn't, then our observation is wrong. Now, contrary to Mr. E's claims, this presuppositional approach to psychology was not first questioned in the 70s. There have been many times said basis has been questioned, but perhaps none more vital than the Magnus Hirschfeld Institute for Sexualwissenschaft, aka the Institute for Sex Research. Started in 1919, this German institute studied both sexuality and gender and noted various things. First, it noted that groups that had been for the longest time been homogenized by Christianity had distinct differences, forming smaller communities existing under one umbrella. This was the period where gender and sexuality began to be separated into what would evolve into the modern LGBT+ community, with trans identities being distinguished from sexualities. What they also found was no basis for the pathologization of these demographics. The Hirschfeld Institute began to offer lessons on safe sex for homosexuals and basic forms of body conformation for trans people. They began to help LGBT+ people instead of pathologizing them. Sadly, this was relatively short-lived, as in 1933, the institute was raided by Nazi forces, its books and research confiscated and used in public book burnings. Indeed, many of the books used in these events came from said institute. The Nazis' justification for this was cultural Bolshevism, the Nazi original for the same boogeyman Mr. E calls cultural Marxism. The Nazis, much like Mr. E in his videos, pretended that homosexuality would result in German society crumbling from within and set about arresting the users of the institute services as well as many of its employees. These people were then shipped off to concentration camps under the Pink Triangle. However, the horrors don't end there. When the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, they didn't set free the Pink Triangles as they did with other groups sent to concentration camps. Instead, many of the Pink Triangles were kept imprisoned. This shouldn't be surprising, considering that the British government were all too happy to sentence codebreaker Alan Turing, whose work in bypassing the Enigma not only shortened the war by several years, effectively saving tens if not hundreds of millions of lives, but also fathered modern computing to chemical castration for being a homosexual. Alan Turing's treatment was so poor that shortly afterwards he committed suicide. The government has to date still not released any official apology accepting responsibility for said heinous atrocities, only having posthumously pardoned him and others sentenced under the same laws. So whilst Mr. E wants to complain about protesters using their right to protest to go after the facts that not a single psychological institution could provide proper justification for why homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder, he completely ignores the real acts of fascism carried out by both the Nazis and the Allies during and after the Second World War. He wishes to pretend that none of the history spanning the last 10,000 years laid out and referenced exists, claiming this to simply be a recent phenomenon and nothing more. Thankfully, his attempts to rewrite history do not sit with those who actually draw on evidence to make a conclusion.
Today we know that the fields of psychology and psychiatry are highly prone to being exploited in this manner, whether it's pharmaceutical companies pushing questionable drugs onto patients for profit, or political correctness banning and cherry-picking research. This has ruined the respect of these fields, but it's not an isolated incident.
None of the articles you flashed on screen demonstrated what you just asserted, and none were actual studies. The first was an opinion piece which held psychiatric drugs to a different standard to psychotherapy, listing the past failures of psychiatric drugs and similar methods as a reason to distrust them, before admitting early psychotherapy also had numerous failures and downplaying that. Now, it may be worth discussing the American Medical Institute as a whole when it comes to mental health in America, but to place the blame on any one specific approach when different people respond better to different methods is reductionist and arrogant. The second was a public statement published by the American Psychological Association in support of Obama's calls to put an end to the internationally recognized human rights violation, reparative torture, sometimes labeled as reparative or conversion therapy by its supporters. Said torture has never been proven to work in changing a person's gender or sexuality, merely forcing people back into the closet and putting them at increased risk of suicide. If you want to claim otherwise, then provide a replicated clinical study of said practices, like every actual medical procedure goes through, as until then all you are doing is projecting your lack of evidence onto everyone else. It's up to you to prove that reparative torture works, not for us to prove that it doesn't. You're simply standing there with a bottle of snake oil in hand, asserting that the scientists have ignored the evidence or failed to prove that it doesn't work. The third was a news article discussing a study that was not being critiqued because of the conclusions it reached. Rather, it was critiqued for the methodology in relation to how it was being presented by conservative voices and to understand why we have to first understand the scientific impact of extraneous variables. Extraneous variables refers to items that you are not seeking to measure, yet may impact your results if not accounted for. So say I wanted to measure how much light a certain brand of light bulb put out compared to a competitor brand. The way this would be done would be put both lights in a perfectly dark room and measure the light units in lux. Now, to make sure that the lux difference between the two bulbs was only the result of the bulbs themselves, I'd have to ensure that in both cases the natural lux was equivalent, preferably 0, just to be safe. If, however, I change the conditions for one of the brands, allowing some external light in for one and not for the other, that would invalidate my results, as I'd no longer just be measuring the differences between the brands. That difference would be part of the equation, but I'd also be measuring how much external light had made it inside the room with one of the tests. Now, the same basic principle exists with people and psychology. If I compared children raised in heterosexual households with an average larger income versus children raised in homosexual households with an on average smaller income due to discrimination, I'm not measuring the impact of being raised in a homosexual household, but the impact of discrimination and a resulting lower income. And the author of the study acknowledges this in the conclusion of said study. Their study did not give any credence to the claim that children raised by same-gender couples are more likely to be less stable children, only that this is the case in a society which discriminates against homosexual parents. In short, if society sets out to make things more difficult for you as a couple, then any children said couple have are likely to suffer as a result. Now, the way the conclusion was worded has come under fire for being far too watery, allowing people such as Mr. E to run away with said conclusion and pretend it demonstrates something it did not. But all of this is pretty irrelevant since science relies on a consensus of available data, not the conclusion of a single study. Cornell University did a meta-analysis of over 79 different studies. Now, out of these 79 studies, 75 demonstrated that there was no difference between children raised in a same-sex household versus those who weren't. Only 4 studies in the whole 79 available, which included the Regnera study that was being discussed in the news article, only 4 out of 79 found there to be any difference. So if you want to talk about ignoring the evidence, how about we start by talking about how you ignore 94.9% of all available evidence.
Academia also suffers with this problem on a mass scale, as does the rest of society, now that safeguards designed to prevent this kind of subversion have been broken down over many decades. Former president of the American Psychological Association, Dr. Nicholas Andrew Cummings, explained in an interview how homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness by using subversive tactics. He stated that the Council of Representatives in the American Psychological Association passed a resolution in 1975, one that he himself created. The resolution, however, stated that scientific research should be conducted to support a vote for declassification.
I made the resolution that being gay was not a mental illness. It was characterological. And it passed the Council of Representatives. And that was the first issue that came up. I also said that with that the APA, if it passes this resolution, will also vote to continue research that demonstrates whatever the research demonstrates, unbiased, open research. Was never done.
Not only was this research never conducted, but the Leona-Tyler principle requiring adherence to objective scientific research eventually mysteriously disappeared from the annals of the APA.
All of a sudden, things began to change as things became more political than scientific. The Leona-Tyler principle, which was never withdrawn, disappeared. In fact, you can't even find it in the annals of the APA. If I didn't have it, it wouldn't exist as far as they're concerned.
The agenda to normalize homosexuality then morphed into purely a civil rights issue, the narrative being that the scientific case had been settled. We've seen similar tactics every time the left promotes a cause. Whatever flawed evidence or disingenuous argument was initially made is quickly abandoned once it's served its purpose, at which point it's nigh on impossible to turn the clocks back. This succeeds because organisations are co-opted by leftists that silence and destroy opposition to their agenda by whatever means necessary, with no consideration for honesty or decency.
Well, the Leona-Tyler principle simply requires that all public positions of the American Psychological Association be supported by scientific evidence. The American Psychological Association's public position on homosexuality at that time was that it was indeed a mental disorder. However, as noted, there was no evidence to base this assertion upon. Now, according to Mr. E and Dr. Nicholas Cummings, dropping the unscientific assertion that homosexuality was a mental disorder was the end of said principle, when in actuality it was the Leona-Tyler principle being implemented retroactively to said baseless assertion. There was no basis to class homosexuality as a mental disorder, therefore the American Psychological Association had to abandon said public position per the guidelines laid down by said principle. Had they not, they would have broken said principle.
Dr. Cummings also explained how this took place in the APA when around 250 leftists ran the organisation from within.
It became part of the movement for what one might call diversity. You want to bring all underrepresented peoples into psychology. For years, about 200 to 250 people were running the APA, and they were a very select, inbred group. They were ultra-liberal, and anything that wasn't ultra-liberal was anathema.
Great. Now if only you had some actual evidence of this, because all we currently have is an organisation that stopped propagating the myth that homosexuality was a mental disorder, as it had no scientific basis to make said assertion. Now I don't know Dr. Nicholas Cummings' backstory. I don't really care. What I care about is the actual science, and if either he or Mr. E has evidence that homosexuality is a mental disorder, then I'm happy to hear that and change my position on the basis of that evidence. But you've had what? More than 10,000 years to do that, and so far you haven't managed to do so. I'm less interested in your claim about the rampant bias, more interested in the evidence to show it. Being skeptical and assessing the evidence is not the same as wearing tinfoil and talking about cabals when you fail to support your case.
In the same vein, the other APA organisation, the American Psychiatric Association, also changed the classification of homosexuality without proper consideration for science. In August 1971, Newsweek magazine described political pressure put on the APA thusly, quote, "But even more than the government, it is the psychiatrists who have experienced the full rage of the homosexual activists. Over the past 2 years, gay lib organisations have repeatedly disrupted medical meetings, and 3 months ago, in the movement's most aggressive demonstration so far, a group of 30 militants broke into a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in Washington, where they turned the staged proceedings into near chaos for 20 minutes. We are here to denounce your authority to call us sick or mentally disordered," shouted the group's leader, Dr. Franklin Kameny, while the 2,000 shocked psychiatrists looked on in disbelief. "For us as homosexuals, your profession is the enemy incarnate. We demand that psychiatrists treat us as human beings, not as patients to be cured," unquote. Dr. Franklin Kameny then threatened more and worse disruptions in an open letter to the Psychiatric News if homosexuality wasn't declassified by the APA. Other intimidation tactics were also employed, like the National Gay Task Force sending intimidating letters to APA members after somehow acquiring their addresses. A vote was then passed in 1974, despite 7,000 of almost 18,000 members abstaining and less than 2/3 of its members voting for this to take place. The tactics to normalise same-sex attraction have become a template for every other form of sexual deviancy. Mentally ill people impose their insanity onto others because they want to feel normal and hate it when people don't embrace their delusions. Is this really what we now call science?
No. Science is referring to the evidence provided in peer-reviewed journal articles to come to an informed conclusion as to whether or not a behaviour is a mental disorder. Something completely absent from your video. Instead, you rely on news articles, magazine trimmings, and a blog post to construct a narrative which is frankly irrelevant. Regardless of whether you see the actions of the early LGBT+ movement as a desperate and brave struggle of second-class citizens looking for equal rights or the atrocities of the mentally ill, all that matters is the science. So why then have you completely ignored the science whilst I've not only dived right into it, but actually read the journal articles mentioned in the news stories you flash on screen? If you genuinely believe that science consists of reading a few newspaper articles, then you seriously need to do some self-reflection. When it comes to science, it's either go to the source or go home. Hi there. I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, and Alexander Williams. Your support has ensured this channel's ability to grow over the years. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe, hit the bell icon, and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, a humanist organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's work to keep this space one which upholds the values of humanism. Thank you.